we're using nature 1.7 times faster than the planet can regenerate, which is equivalent to using the resources of 1.7 Earths. And we call the day when we use up the Earth's resources Earth Overshoot Day, and every day after that is when we're using up extra resources.
That was a clip of Daisy Nicholls and her godfather James Cameron from their new podcast series Fossil versus Future. Using warm debate and chat, they explore the challenges of our climate crisis through different lenses in the hope of fostering an understanding between generations. James is a seasoned barrister, entrepreneur, professor, mentor, environmentalist, and is credited as being one of the architects of COP, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. He's been pushing for change for decades. I heard James speak at an event for the Convet Seascape Survey, an ambitious data-led 5-year research project to determine the vital role a healthy ocean can play in the fight against a warming planet. Daisy is 30 and works in sustainable finance. She was inspired to work in sustainability after witnessing the effects of climate change and a lack of resources on communities in Nepal. And I'm delighted to welcome both James and Daisy to our Pall Mall Deposit studio in London. It is lovely to have you both here, podcasters on our podcast. Daisy, how did your podcast come about?
I think it originally was James's idea, but I've been lucky enough to have James as my godfather growing up. So as I was exploring and expanding my career in sustainability, I've always had James there as a guide to help me and to learn more about climate change. And I've always enjoyed our conversations about sustainability and about climate change because we can both bring our generational perspectives. We do normally agree.
Mostly, yeah.
But it's really interesting to get that perspective and to have someone to look to for that expertise in climate change. And I wanted to learn more about climate change as I'm forming my opinions and growing my career in sustainability, but also to share what I have learned so far and dive deeper into different topics related to climate change.
You certainly couldn't wish for anybody better to do your podcast with. James, you're a boomer and have been involved in climate change for decades. In fact, since Daisy was born, really, in various guises, including as an international lawyer. What does seeing the issues through Daisy's eyes mean for you?
It's very important to be able to do that. The intergenerational angle on climate is central, I think. They are going to be the generation, and behind them, other generations are going to inherit a really serious problem that needs resolving in the time frame that is now shorter, but where my generation, I believe, owes their generation a service. We should be in service to their generation. We've done our best, I think, in many respects to resolve a problem, but it hasn't been resolved. And I think it's useful to try and find the different lenses on what the solutions might be. Where is the common ground? What is our combined understanding of the technological solutions? What's the receptiveness to this or that innovation? What are the barriers? Is there a different perspective on some of these ways of solving the problem? And we have different types of power. We have different sorts of access to power. We have different sorts of consumption choices and relationships and organizational abilities and different approaches to the ways in which we might organize a response to climate change. And I was keen to try and find out where that common ground was, partly to avoid the waste of energy from the friction of disagreement and misunderstanding and the kind of lack of empathy that sometimes exists between generations on this problem.
As a millennial, Daisy, how worried are you about Earth Overshoot Day, which we use as part of our introduction, the day when we use up the Earth's resources, which we're helping ourselves to at quite an alarming rate?
Terrified. Yeah, I think all of my friends, we're all really worried about resource use, climate change and all the impacts. And I think every day you just have to go onto a news website, social media, and you'll see another climate disaster happening. And as you said in your intro, I really appreciated when I was in Nepal living with a family there and working in the village, the real impacts of resource scarcity on communities in developing countries. And it's scary. I mean, lack of water, lack of access to water, the climate impacts on growing food, just the things that we really need to survive, let alone the luxury resources that we enjoy in this country.
What sort of things did you see when you were in Nepal?
It was the first time that I'd really experienced how much weather changing is affecting growing crops. and how you're having to adjust what you grow in order to be able to survive. And also water access, so having to walk for about 45 minutes just to get water to drink. So that was something that really hit home with me about how urgently we need to act on this issue.
Do you think sometimes, James, people feel the topic is so enormous and so difficult and complicated to solve that we tend to stick our heads in the sand a little?
Unquestionably. And it's one of the reasons for the podcast, honestly. In addition to the anxiety that Daisy's generation feels, this is a real thing. It's quite widespread, and not just in our society, but pretty universal. I think there's a much higher level of awareness of climate risk in other parts of the world than perhaps we realise. It's felt in a different way. The kind of experiences that Daisy's talking about in Nepal, in some cases, the language will be different to explain the feelings of vulnerability and risk, the dependencies. The case of someone who's living very close to an environmental edge is different from someone who's living in a wealthy country that's got all sorts of layers of protection and greater resilience to those environmental threats. They may not describe those threats in the same way, but they're there and they are felt. And I wanted to be able to have a conversation with Daisy that did something at least to assuage some of that anxiety, but also help deal with that other issue, which is there is something you can do. Don't feel powerless. Don't go nihilistic. Don't give up. Don't feel like there's nothing you can do. It's all someone else's fault, or I'll just be angry and not know how to direct that anger. I think anger is frankly, an understandable energy. It's reminding me of Johnny Rotten now. Anger is an energy. It's true, but direct it. Think about how you're going to use it, where you're going to aim that energy. Whose help do you still need? If you haven't got the power yourself, how do you get it? With whose help? And it might be someone who comes from a different tribe, right? It might be someone who's not like you. It might be someone from another generation. It might be someone who doesn't share your political views, but they have something else. And equally, I have conversations, obviously, with people of my generation who are doing okay, quite sure that they got there by their own merit, that they have these resources because they're sort of entitled to them, and they don't really want to give them up. They don't want to be told the things they like aren't good. There's a whole generation that is proud of the energy that has been found and used and innovated around. I mean, hydrocarbons are extraordinary and they're everywhere in our society. Really hard to imagine not having them. Or the energy systems that have been built over a lifetime, sometimes massively improving the economic lot of the whole of society. Think of the producer nations, or our own. We had obviously our own resources here in the UK. Very hard to say that's a bad thing, right? Except that we now know, don't we? We know. We have the information, we have the evidence, we have some observed experience, lived experience, and we simply have to develop our economies, all of them, away from fossil fuels. So fossil versus future is a name. It's partly because I'm the fossil and she's the future, but it's also because the future isn't fossil.
And what is the future? Or that would fill a whole episode of your podcast and more. But if it's not fossil, where have we got to look?
Well, fortunately, we've got plenty to look at now. So that the transformation that we must make is underway, and it's happening in ways that show that when it's done, the result is good. The new stuff is better than the old stuff. We can electrify almost everything in our economies if we really want to. A huge proportion of the work that needs to be done by usable energy in our economies can be done with electrons rather than molecules, and those electrons can be made in a green way. They also will need to be stored, managed digitally. We'll need to use our electric vehicles to store power. We've got all of those technologies visible now. They're not all joined up. So joining them up, making them harmonious is a technical challenge, largely software driven. Artificial intelligence will play a role, but also needs to be a regulatory change because we've designed regulatory systems around the technologies that we need to move away from. And that's politics and law and social organization and challenging entrepreneurship, new companies who are challenging the incumbents with new technologies and feeling confident that they can beat them. All of those. As if you just focus on power and usable energy, you're allowed to feel confident that that transformation will happen.
And it is, which we'll talk about a little bit later, it is about joining the dots and the blue economy and finance and stuff like that. I'll come to that in a minute. Daisy, you were aware of climate issues from a very young age, not just from James, but didn't your dad take you on climate change marches when you were little?
Yeah, my dad was a member of Greenpeace, so we used to get on the train up to London and go to climate change marches in London, I remember. Yeah, I must have been about 7, I think, when I was going to those, and I went to a few concerts with James.
Yes, that's
There
true.
were Live Earth, I think, that
Yes.
was for climate change.
Yeah.
And I've been going with James again and with my family to Glastonbury Festival every summer since I was younger. And so there's a big environmental movement that comes alongside that as well. So it's always been something that I've been aware of. I can't remember a time that I didn't want to work towards climate change and sustainability in some way.
James, you're a barrister, social entrepreneur, professor, mentor, advocate. What has driven you over the last few decades wearing all those different hats to keep arguing for a fairer and more sustainable planet? And at times, she says, building in a second question, which is very bad form, has it been really frustrating?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in truth, my origin story in the climate change arena is also attributable to Greenpeace, because they asked me to write a legal opinion a long time ago in 1988 on whether you could bring a case before the International Court of Justice for failure to act on climate change against the United States of America.
What year was this?
1988.
1988.
1988.
Oh my goodness. Hang on, was Daisy alive then?
Poor baby.
Pre-Daisy.
Pre-Daisy. Wow.
I wrote that opinion as a junior academic and young international lawyer without any background in the climate change problem, the science. I just reviewed it as evidence, like any lawyer would. And there was plenty of evidence. That's the thing. There was years and years and years of solid scientific evidence about the nature of the problem then. So I didn't have much trouble understanding that there was a problem. The legal arguments are also readily available, and so I constructed the case on state responsibility for climate change, but I argued to Greenpeace that in truth, the US would never submit to the jurisdiction of the International Court, and that frankly, the US was not the only contributor to the problem, and it was a global problem, and why don't you use the same legal arguments and the same scientific evidence to campaign and argue for an international agreement on climate change? I then used that legal opinion to form a law review article, because in the academic world, you have to publish, and so I published this article on state responsibility for climate change, which was the first of its kind with my now longtime friend and colleague Durward Zelke. And that law review article became a pitch for research funding to the Ford Foundation, imagining what an international agreement on climate change would look like if there were to be one. What would you do with the legal principles? What would be the structure? Who would have the obligations? What would be the institutions? And so, together with others in the Centre for International Environmental Law, my dear friend Philippe Sands and others who joined us at the beginning, we created this draft treaty. And then we built a coalition of small island states called AOSIS, the Alliance of Small Island States, first came together in November 1990 and argued from the point of view that they have, the most vulnerable countries, why there should be an international agreement on climate change. And then we managed to persuade others, and we weren't the only ones, of course, but then the international agreement emerged not long thereafter. Took us really a very short period of time, 91 to 92, and then we had the first international agreement on climate change. But that was the Earth Summit in June 1992, and I've been at this all the way along. I carried on negotiating all the subsequent agreements with the small island states, years and years of the COPs. Now we're coming up to 29. And yes, that can be very dispiriting. It really can be. And there are times when you think, can you keep going? There are not very many people who've been in it that long. And one of the ways I manage the feeling that can be quite depressed is by keeping the company of those who are younger than me, but also those who are creating, that are making institutions themselves, entrepreneurs, people who are prepared to put ideas into practice, people who are prepared to take some risk to make change, and to try and be as useful as possible working between disciplines, law, finance, policy, technology, business entrepreneurship. I'm interested in the spaces between them where I find the greatest creativity and therefore the greatest hope of change.
And are those the dots that we have to connect?
Yes, they are, and constantly connect. Because every now and again, there are powerful reasons in your face not to. There's a temporal dimension in pretty much everything to do with climate change. One that's harder and harder actually to fathom because it's seen as a long-term problem, but we're already experiencing short-term consequences, right? And the long-term problem is escaping us. It's accelerating away from us. It's a non-linear problem. It's a systemic problem of huge scale and reach. So things that we thought were targets to avoid, parts per million in the atmosphere or degrees of warming above pre-industrial levels, we're going past those thresholds. Things that we negotiated in those treaty agreements all those years ago, which were points to avoid, so let's not go there. And yet we've gone there and gone past it already. And the things that we are desperately trying to prevent happening are happening. But there's always a short term. There's always a political imperative or a business cycle or a financial reporting requirement that is shorter term. And that's really difficult to manage. And we human beings are very good at fight or flight risk. It's hardwired into our biology. If we see a danger right in front of us, we have capacity to react. But we're not good at something approaching slowly from afar in multiple directions where we have a strong vested interest in thinking it's not a problem at all. And that's hard. You find a lot of the resistance comes from people who have power, who will tell you, if that's what you think the solution is, it can't be a problem, right? If you think the solution is, and this tends to come from a political perspective, more government intervention, then it can't be a problem. If you think the solution is more investment away from fossil fuels, and I'm invested in fossil fuels, then it can't be a problem. It's really difficult to align proper appreciation with the problem and the solutions and the resources to bring the solutions to the problem.
Daisy, when you hear James talk like that, how do you stay positive and determined that, well, we have to make a difference? We don't really have a choice in this, do we?
Exactly. No, it has to be done. And I think something James touched on is people often think about addressing climate change as a sacrifice. Like I have to give something up in order to address this problem. But there's more and more evidence that we can build a better world by addressing this problem. And I'm really interested in food systems, for example, which are often not recognised for their huge contribution to climate change. It's about a quarter to a third of emissions are caused by the food that we produce and consume.
A quarter to a third
is related to,
that's
what we
extraordinary.
eat. So it's a really big part of the climate problem, and we have to address the way that we produce and consume food if we are going to solve the climate crisis. But at the same time, by looking at that problem, we can solve so many other problems. For example, our food system is not actually serving the purpose that our food system should. It's not feeding us healthy, nutritious diets. 2 billion people, I think, globally are either overweight or obese, while nearly, I think, 800,000 are still malnourished. So we're not getting good food at the same time as causing climate harm. And also the food system uses huge amounts of water. It's the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. And so if we do address this climate problem, we will have a better food system. And so I think we need to think of the opportunities rather than focusing on it just being a problem we need to solve.
You feature on your podcast What Abouts, which is where you tackle a subject and you say what about. And I've written a few down that I was curious about. And what about food was on there for you, Daisy, because you've actually been very active in working, well, with a charity and also Tesco's examining what about food. Tell us a bit about the investigations you've done and the findings.
I studied chemistry at university, so I was very interested in learning the science as a foundation to all of this. But then I started working for a charity called the Felix Project soon after graduating, which is a food redistribution charity. So they collect food that would otherwise go to waste and redistribute it to charity to feed those that are hungry in London. That was a real eye-opener for me. I learned that a third of the food that we produce is wasted. And you really can see that when you go to supermarkets and cafes at the end of the day, the amount of perfectly good food that would otherwise get thrown away if the Felix Project and others weren't redistributing it. And seeing all that waste was what inspired me to then work for Tesco in their supply chain team, because one of the main things that you're working towards in building an efficient supply chain is reducing costs. And one of the ways that you can do that is by reducing the amount of food that you're wasting. So I worked in forecasting roles trying to figure out how much fruit and vegetables we thought Tesco was going to sell in order to maximize sales and then reduce the amount of food that was going to waste, which was quite challenging during the pandemic.
I can imagine.
There were a lot of uncertainties there. And then I also worked in roles where we were trying to, for example, reduce the number of trucks on the road by getting suppliers to combine their deliveries. So there are lots of different ways that you can build a better supply chain, so build a business case while also addressing the climate change problem.
I do like Daisy's view, which I'm sure you probably share, James, of finding the positives and finding how we can actually make a better world and not seeing climate change as this massive sacrifice that we all have to make. And I think one example that interests me a lot is the ocean. And obviously, you know that I've been involved in the Convex Seascape Survey, so I'm aware of the ocean. But before we talk about the positives, what will happen to our ocean if temperatures continue to rise?
Our oceans are saving us right now. They're an amazing storer of CO2. They have helped us enormously cope with the atmospheric chemistry that is driving a warmer world. But we can't carry on treating them in that way because there are real consequences for their own health and viability. In fact, it's a really good place to put effort to figure out how best the oceans should be managed, because let's face it, we are a huge influence on all environments. So there is an element of management pretty much everywhere. The oceans are vast, really vast. I mean, more extensive than people, I think, can feel unless they live in an island country. But it's a huge area that is often outside individual jurisdictions, that has capacity to absorb an awful lot of CO2. But when the oceans start to get very warm, there are real consequences for us and other species. They also acidify with all that CO2 going into the oceans. And that's not good for many species. The combination of warming and acidification, warming obviously also accelerates all the other weather-related phenomena that have an effect on us, like cyclones and hurricanes and typhoons and powerful rain bursts that we've just recently experienced in Spain. But there are also problems associated with many, many different forms of life that come from a warming ocean, whether it's corals that can't survive with relatively small changes in temperature. And corals are enormously important ecosystems in themselves, living organisms that support myriad other living organisms. And when they die off, others really suffer too. The same with plankton, obviously a crucial food for numerous species in the oceans. The food system, the food web, the food chain, how we describe it, has these dependencies on creatures that are very heavily influenced by water temperature and water chemistry. So we really do need to know a lot more about the oceans and what we should stop doing. Equally, there are life forms in the oceans that can help us store carbon. Seaweed, sea kelp, sea grasses of various kinds have enormous capacity to absorb CO2, grow incredibly rapidly, more rapidly than, say, a forest, but with huge potential to help us out if we can cultivate those forms of biodiverse life. And the more we can do that, the more we'll also encourage other life forms to exist around it. It's very good for fishing nurseries, if you like, to grow more mangroves, for example. Mangroves are a very good buffer against sea level rise. So all of these biological responses, nature-based responses to climate change, have real benefit to us and many, many other living things.
And what's interesting, I think, James, about the ocean is the speed with which it will and can heal if we treat it properly. So if we stop overfishing, if we stop damaging the seabed. One of the scientists involved in the Seascape Survey said that if you looked at Earth from space, the ocean would cover 90-something% of our planet, and it should be the world's biggest natural carbon sink. So I suppose the good news is it can heal, can't it? And it can, really can help save us, really.
It really can. It's one of the most encouraging aspects of the two interconnected crises of climate and nature. The capacity for natural systems to restore themselves, given the chance, is immense. And that goes for land or sea or river. Left alone, the repair happens really amazingly fast. So when you have protected areas of ocean bed, for example, and we have some good experiments that are live here in the UK, right? If you stop dredging, if you stop scraping the ocean floor and leave it alone for a period of time, it restores very quickly. There are various interventions that we think can help move it faster. So we've had tremendous loss of oyster beds, for example, oyster reefs. There are enterprises now who are showing us how we might restore those reefs artificially, or creating the structures that will draw oysters into a particular place and provide them with the kind of environment that they want to build their own communities. These are things that I find encouraging. There are lots of enterprises now that are thinking about how to use seaweed as an alternative to hydrocarbon-based plastics, for example. There's an organisation that went through the Imperial College programme that I've got a connection with, and Daisy was at Imperial too, so there's some sort of dual connection here, called NOPLA, which is a plastics alternative business based upon seaweed. There are others around who are looking into the chemistry of hydrocarbons and then ask, what if we didn't use fossil fuels to get the same benefit from a different chemistry, but a related chemistry from a bioproduct? And could we cultivate that and organize an industrial response that would be of value to find substitutes? And seaweed's looking promising. It has to be the right type, has to be grown in the right place in the right way. But on the whole, it's an example of innovation taking place under stress and pressure to find solutions that should offer encouragement.
We've done podcasts with young people who are using so-called non-recyclable plastic bags provided free of charge from a local council who can't recycle them to make incredible bespoke speakers, and another young company in Cornwall who are using abandoned ghost gear and fishing nets to make sunglasses. It's amazing to see some of these ideas coming from younger people, Daisy. Your podcast is in its infancy at the moment. You've done a few episodes, but plastics hasn't been featured yet. I'm guessing there will be a What About Plastics?
I would love to do a What About Plastics episode. I think that's something as individuals we can really see in our day-to-day lives. Sometimes climate change can be quite tricky because you can't see emissions and they're not so tangible as something like plastics. And it was something I was really interested in working for Tesco's, how they can reduce their plastics. But again, it's a challenge because you reduce plastics, for example, on fruit and vegetables, and you might increase food waste by reducing their shelf life. So there are a lot of trade-offs to consider when you're exploring things like plastic reduction.
What about finance, Daisy, to drive change with your financial hat on?
Yeah, so I now work for Impact Arc, which is a women-owned sustainable finance advisory firm, and we work with investors who want to shift their money towards having a positive environmental and social impact. And we have done a What About Finance episode, but it is going to cost a lot. But it's about reframing it again as an investment rather than a cost. We're investing in our future. And if we don't do anything about climate, it's going to cost a lot more. The cost of inaction is astronomical.
Orders of magnitude
goodness.
bigger. I should say, just by way of explanation, Daisy and I had conversations in family, in work, in amongst peer group, where the what about phrase was sometimes used passively aggressively to either shut down a conversation. Oh, you haven't thought about this, so what about? Or to show off what they've just recently read in their favorite newspaper or whatever. Mm-hmm. And it often either killed a conversation, especially if it was sometimes an older male to a younger female. You can see the dynamic that would happen there. And so we thought we would do our own list of familiar whatabouts. And
that list is going to be quite endless, isn't it?
There's a lot of them coming up, yeah. And they shift, but there are some consistent ones. And the what about the cost is a familiar one. What about China is definitely one we get all the time. And we thought, okay, well, let's use that as a device. So together with the intergenerational framing, we would use what about to start the conversation. And the what about the cost or what about the finance is two sides of the same coin. And it also deals with the issues that most affect decision makers that do have power, because they've got to make decisions for allocating mostly capital resources. And the shape of the capital deployments is remarkably similar in that the new infrastructure, the new generation, the new vehicles, they all have a capital cost hurdle to get over. But once you're over that hurdle, on the whole, and in sum, there are lower operating costs. And, as Daisy says, They get you to the solution of the problem, which takes away the cost of dealing with the problem, which is immense and dwarfs the cost of the actions required.
Do we then need to reframe, James, how we think about money, finance, investment, and what exactly is the blue economy to a layman?
To a layman, yes. Well, the blue economy is a really interesting concept. It's beginning to have more shape as investments start to appear, and they actually cover some of the things we were just talking about. So a blue economy investment would be in growing mangroves along a coastline that would protect the shore from sea level rise and storm surges and provide a nursery for fisheries and, in some instances anyway, help protect agricultural land where you might also be growing food. And finding a way to value that investment is not easy because it doesn't necessarily have a direct financial return. The financial return has to be picked up in the other values attributed to it, which, by the way, is directly relevant to insurance and reinsurance because there are costs associated with the damage and there are savings associated with preventing it. So it's a place where we need to do some rethinking about how we allocate our resources. We have phenomenal capital resources. We are not short of capital, but it doesn't flow to the places where we need it. It doesn't flow sufficiently to the things we now know we can invest in that reduce risk. It's happening. If you're tracking renewable energy investment, for example, it's really picking up pace. People on the whole now are not investing in fossil fuels. There are some examples, of course there are, but by comparison, the percentages are all in favour of clean energy for new capacity. That's a good sign. The take-up of electric vehicles is growing all over the world, most particularly actually in China. After a certain threshold percentage, nobody knows exactly what it is, but after a certain threshold, they're not going to go back. That's an infrastructure that's going to get built around electric vehicles, not fossil fuels. That capital outlay is happening and the operational costs will be lower and there's no suffering involved in that. That's a better system. But for natural capital, for the blue economy investments, you still, for now at least, require some kind of government intervention, some policy incentive, something that rewards the work done to deliver this environmental benefit in the oceans. Sometimes it's a little bit more straightforward. Say you're an island economy that's vulnerable to sea level rise and hurricanes and those sorts of things, but has a thriving tourist industry. If you can get an investment that combines protecting, making more resilient the shoreline from sea level rise and storm surges, finding ways of using the natural environment to manage that risk, because the natural environment is pretty good at breaking up waves and distributing the impact of heavy rainfall, for example, with maintaining or hopefully improving your tourism industry, then there's a direct economic benefit that comes from that. But actually, the financial services world is not well adapted to making these kinds of investments. It's very short term. It makes decisions on models that do not, mostly anyway, do not include these big non-linear climate risks. Natural capital is not routinely valued in investments. We see signs that might be coming with interventions that are on the horizon. But on the whole, the mainstream of finance does not do that.
Have you found that too, Daisy, working in finance?
Definitely. But it's increasing and there's a lot more interest in how to do sustainable investment. But as James said, it is still tricky to get the data, tricky to fit it into existing financial models and existing systems. But it makes sense. It makes financial sense. And there are lots of places that you can move your money in a way that makes money now. There is a business case to be had from addressing climate change and other sustainable problems. And if we don't, there's stranded assets. There are reasons that your money will go down in value as a result.
We've mentioned China briefly twice. Yeah. Daisy, what about China?
Yeah.
I think what about China is one that I've learned a lot about actually from doing the podcast with James. It was always a question that I almost asked myself. I heard about China and was almost nervous about China and what was going on. But the more I've learned, the more I've realized that China is doing a lot to address the climate problem and is people think, how is the world going to reduce emissions when China's emissions are so great? But China recognizes the benefits of addressing climate change. They're a leader in electric vehicles, for example. So I think China is a big innovator in this space and shouldn't be seen as a bad guy as they often are.
There are all sorts of reasons to have anxiety about China as a geopolitical force. In particular, the current regime is quite aggressive externally, and there are conflicts all over the place in the trade system and the moves towards Taiwan that one has to factor in. But there really isn't much space, once you know what's going on in China, for the argument that China is doing nothing about climate, because that's just silly now. You're willfully ignoring what's real. China is number one in wind, solar, electric vehicles, batteries, and pretty much everything that goes to make them all function effectively. They have the systems to finance, to manufacture, they have the raw materials, they've deliberately stacked up the supply chains. So for electric vehicles, batteries, raw materials, manufacturing of batteries and cars, they're all there, together with enormous demand. China is electrifying its economy. And yes, there are coal-fired power stations. And yes, they built more of them in recent years, although they did build cleaner ones than the ones there before. But the direction of travel is really obvious. They're electrifying their economy. They're taking away dependence upon imported fossil fuels. They're crushing the demand for liquid fossil fuels in the world because they're so big. Over 50% of their vehicle purchases here are electric. The vehicle population is vast. So once they'll keep going. When that happens, fossil fuel demand for liquid fuels in China will decline. And because it's so big, it will have an effect globally. Now, other countries have gone further, Norway, but it's a much smaller economy. People just don't buy internal combustion engine vehicles in Norway now. They're all electric, pretty much. Other countries, many of them are approaching 20, 25%, that sort of number. Before long, your electric vehicle stock means that you will just not need to purchase more liquid fuels, at least for transportation. We'll still use them for other things. All right, well, China is going to provide lower cost everything for everybody else if they choose to buy them.
When I hear you speak like that, it makes me realise that I feel, and I've had a little bit of experience in this world, that we are a little bit backwards in Britain with this. I was involved in the startup business looking at putting infrastructure in for electric vehicles and electric aircraft, which aren't very far away, but we just haven't put the infrastructure in. And just personally, I haven't bought an electric car because I trot up to Lincolnshire regularly, and you go up the motorway, and if you do find a charger, they're often broken or there's queues, or I don't think we really commit. And then we moved the deadline, didn't we, for the sale of new petrol vehicles from 2030 to 2035. And it feels like, in my humble opinion, we haven't got that 5 years to play with. That doesn't feel like a proper commitment to me.
It may be irrelevant anyway. There are probably half a dozen Chinese manufacturers of electric vehicles that you've never heard of, and with some silly names, who are producing electric vehicles that are superior. I mean, they're better vehicles. And I mean better, because I do think we have to have a conversation with ourselves and our peers and with the country as a whole that we don't want this to be sacrifice, actually. And one of the things that Tesla did so brilliantly, in a way, was to create an alluring electric vehicle, a cool one.
I like the way you say that, alluring electric vehicle.
You don't want this to be hair shirt. We still have a strange fascination, and we still feel this. Maybe your generation is not so much, actually. There's not much status in a car for your generation.
No,
actually.
not so much.
But there still is for an older generation, and they're still cared for.
He's looking at me, Daisy.
Yeah. They're still
I'm not a
cared
boomer,
for.
just saying. Just.
So it matters that the vehicles are better, not just that they're electric. The truth is that the new batteries that are going in these things are phenomenal. We talk about one in our podcast that, believe me, there'll be another one next week, which is better. The innovation's happening exponentially. So the one we talk about in our podcast, which wasn't that long ago, was a Samsung battery that takes 9 minutes to fully charge and will take you 650 kilometers. But equally, if you go down all those hard to name, or BYD is quite easy to remember, but a lot of them are hard to name, and you take out the electric vehicle equivalent to their fossil fuel equivalent, you try and match them up, Porsche against, or they will be faster. Their range will be just as much, or if not greater, than the tank full of petrol. That wasn't the case even 6 months ago. And they'll be more economic to run, and they'll be the same or less cost to buy with those new Chinese vehicles. And the Chinese economy is tuning itself to providing these vehicles for everyone, not for the rich. So if you go to any Chinese city now, the taxis, They're all electric. You're constantly passed by electric bikes, but the infrastructure is good. Taxi drivers got no dramas, no fear. Equally, if you go to India now, one of the organisations that I work with, a company called Sun Mobility, they do electric vehicle charging stations, and they do them in kind of kiosks, which a lot of them are on the forecourts of petrol stations, which I quite like. They're solar powered, and you come with a little fob, you open a cabinet, you take out a battery, you shove it in your bike, or they focus mainly on bikes and rickshaws, also last mile delivery vehicles, not personal cars, and buses too, different structure, bigger. But it's quicker to do that exchange, battery to battery swap, than filling with liquid fuels. And it's more economical. So that the person who's living very close to the edge of being able to feed the family every day, they're not making these decisions because they're members of Greenpeace. They're delivering stuff in New Delhi, and it's more economic for them to do that by an electric battery swapping vehicle than it is through very cheap, very dirty diesel.
You mentioned they're living close to the edge, and I know you've been heavily involved, James, with the small island developing states, and that they do live, I suppose you could say, on the front line of climate change. What are the worst things that you've witnessed, or can you give us a sense of why these places really are on the front line and what sort of things that they are experiencing?
Yeah, well, it's existential for the small islands. And there are places I'm afraid we pretty much know now will not be habitable within a generation. And there's a way of thinking about that which is perhaps not widely understood. There's not just hurricanes and typhoons and things like that. That's a manifestation. The real issue for a lot of them, especially the coral atolls, is saltwater invasion of their fresh water. So when the dynamics between fresh and salt water are changed, it could be because of a storm surge that breaks through the coral. It will find as often the fresh water is in a dip. I could draw it for you, but you probably imagine it. When your fresh water gets polluted by salt water, then obviously you can't use it for what we need fresh water for, right? Whether it's for drinking or cooking or growing things. We have absurd situations now where people have to import fresh water. You know that's not viable longer term. And there are islands in the Pacific, for example, that already have agreements with neighbouring islands that do have land so for example, Kiribati, spelled Kiribati but pronounced Kiribati, was one of the island states in the coalition that I work with. They have an agreement with Fiji that does have high land in the middle of the island to be able to move there when the time comes. Right? They've been allocated land that they can occupy. And there have been discussions among many Pacific Island countries with Australia and New Zealand about when the time comes, will you take us? And of course that leads into all of the discussions that we are very familiar with, or at least we ought to be, that climate change and migration go together. People will leave when they feel threatened. They'll leave when they can't have fresh water or access to it. So the small island states are, in my mind, and always were, all the way back to the late 80s, they are the most vulnerable, but their case is our case. They're simply making it in a more vulnerable position than we are. They're making the case for action that would benefit us all.
They are also at the front line then of solutions.
Yes, they can't do much on their own territories, can they? They're not the source of industrial output. They can only solve their problem by cooperating with somebody else. That's why the international agreements are so important. I mean, they're easily derided for their slowness, their bureaucratic nature, the fact that people have some deep resistance to the idea that governments might be able to fix anything. You know, there's a kind of cynicism, particularly in our political worlds. But if you're St. Lucia or Vanuatu, I was on the delegation of Vanuatu for many years, or the Seychelles, these magnificent island cultures that are so vulnerable, their ways of life are so exposed to risk. You're not making the problem. You're not able to find the solution on your own territory. You've got no power to force anybody to do anything. You can only persuade. And persuasion doesn't amount to much unless you have law. The rule of law in international law, believe it or not, exists. It's often broken, but there are consequences of breaking the law.
Well, my final what about, which I'll get Daisy to kick off because she spends so much time with you, so I'm sure she'll have something to say, is what about international law in making countries address issues like air pollution? How critical is international law, Daisy?
Multiple times it's about all the different sectors coming together, but law is a very important part. Law and finance, I believe, are two key ways to drive action. We spoke in one of our episodes about ecocide, which is an upcoming, hopefully, international law to punish entities, I guess, who harm nature, and it will be on the same level of crime as genocide. So it's very serious in terms of the effects. But yeah, I think international law and even at a lower level regulation is a huge driver for changing businesses and the way that people act.
And is there enough powerful international law to make people behave the right way with all of this, James?
We're currently going through a phase of inactivity, and I would call it a kind of nationalist, populist rejection of international institutions of all kinds. In many parts of the world, a kind of antipathy towards the United Nations, a lack of respect for those institutions. The World Trade Organization would be another one. And I think I'd like to believe that this is a genuinely objective view, but it probably isn't. I take the view that there are very big danger signs, irrespective of your concern about climate, in attacking and undermining institutions that provide the capacity to deal peacefully with disputes, disagreements, conflicts, and to provide the opportunity to trade, build joint enterprises, solve problems together. These institutions, the ones that carry the most weight, despite this backlash that's going on at the moment, have always been created after conflict, after war. And after a while, people tend to get complacent about those, and they turn their lack of enthusiasm about some decision against the institution, and then there's war, and then we have to build them again. And I'd rather like to stop short of that. There happens to be a really, I think, compelling confluence of interests between energy security, climate security, and peace and security. You know, if you can build systems that provide people with their essential needs without importing fossil fuels, with exposed supply chains, but with superabundant light and other natural resources where there isn't an intermediary, right? There's still some technology, but the light's ubiquitous. I see that as being a help in keeping the peace. But I also believe that these institutions need investing in. They need time and appreciation and acceptance that they are clunky and big, but would be a whole lot worse off without them. And in some instances, they have worked. So ozone depletion, unquestionably. International agreement was successful. We restored a hole in the ozone layer. We saved a whole lot of people from skin cancer and other consequences of an ozone hole being open and exposing us to radiation of various kinds. We've had successes in marine pollution, in regional seas. I think we've had successes in taking international agreements and turning them into national law or regional agreements and being more effective there, in the European Union, for example. But we're under real pressure at the moment. There are too many people who are wanting to celebrate their difference as opposed to their ability to cooperate. And without cooperation, can't solve this one.
You have been at pretty much every COP. And as an architect of COP, you were COP before it was even called that.
Even before it was called a COP. Yeah.
Do you still feel progress is being made when we have these meetings?
Yes, I do. I'm a bit worn out, frankly, by them. Perseverance is necessary. I don't see good alternatives. I do argue for, and have done in the past, taking parts of the problem and finding solutions in smaller groups of countries or through subject matter or sectoral agreements. I think you could do a hell of a lot with sectors like steel or cement or chemicals, where you wouldn't need every country in the world to be around the table, but you could get countries and companies and institutions that could provide data, monitor, judge performance, accelerate innovation. I mean, I do believe we could do better, but I don't think we can do without at least one global process that brings everybody together. And as we say on the podcast, allows those who don't have a voice to be heard, whether they're a small island state in the dot in the Pacific, or whether they're a civil society organisation that may not get heard in their own jurisdiction. Lord knows there are environmental organisations that are under huge pressure in their own home, but can be heard on an international stage, and that sometimes makes a difference. Or it could be just academics getting together to collaborate, or businesses finding finance. These events now are very big and very diverse, and they have a range of actors, different types of power that you need to pull together to get the solutions to emerge.
Daisy, you shared a compelling statistic from the International Energy Agency, which was so compelling, I've written it down, you'll be relieved to know. This was the quote that you used on one of your episodes. Children born today will emit 10 times less carbon during their lifetimes than their grandparents if the world achieves the goal of reducing global emissions to net zero by 2050. What are your thoughts, Daisy? Is it realistic now, do you think, in 2024? This is the $6 million question. Do you think we will achieve that goal?
Yes.
Go, Daisy.
Good answer, Daisy.
We have to. We have to find a way to achieve it.
It's not a choice, is it?
Exactly. It's not a choice. And I mean, even now, as you say, in 2024, we're seeing catastrophic weather events happening here, right here in Europe. The videos in the news of Spain recently have just been shocking. So the fact that we're already seeing these stories happen, we have to do something and we have to act now. So I think, yeah, we have no choice.
We'll get there.
Exactly.
I really love your podcast and I wish you both the best with it. I'm definitely a listener and a follower now. And I've been slightly cheeky because I've used your theme tune today to play us in, and also I'm going to use it to play us out. So James, just leave us with the story behind the music, if you would.
Lovely, yes. So this comes from Nick Nuttall. Nick is a journalist, wrote for The Times, an environment correspondent, and for years and years and years did the communications for the UN system on environment. And he was brilliant at it. And we often worked together during all those COPs and all the sometimes very dull meetings that he had to make more interesting for journalists. And now he works with an organisation called We Don't Have Time, which is a climate communications organisation. But he's always played music. He's always had a band. He's always done things on the side. And then not so long ago, he sent me an album. Well, actually, I bought it.
Oh, good. I'm glad you bought it, James.
And it has this song on it. And I asked his permission to use it, which he gave. And we have just taken the music, not the lyrics, but I do hope people like it. And thank you very much, Nick.
Well, it's a lovely way to play us out. You've been listening to James Cameron and his goddaughter Daisy Nicholls, two passionate environmentalists, as well as all the other various hats they wear in their working life. They're both working hard at the heart of the climate crisis, and they're co-hosting a new podcast series, Fossil versus Future, which is well worth seeking out on all the usual platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Download and subscribe to our series at convex.podbean.com, or you can search The Convex Conversation on the same platform, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to yours. There are more than 180 episodes to choose from. I'll be back next week with another great guest, so see you then.